pleased to welcome all of you to SID-Washington's 2010 annual conference. I'm hearing from everyone that the morning program has been especially stimulating. I know you will find the afternoon program equally compelling. We have an exciting panel discussion on new paradigms for development for 2010 and beyond, as well as the presentation of SID-Washington's first annual Media Award. We have now come to a very special part of our program today, the presentation of the Truman Award. The Truman Award of Leadership and Innovation by Young Professionals in International Development was established to recognize the achievements of a young professional working in our field and is awarded annually by the SID-Washington chapter. The award is designed to honor an individual who has exhibited exceptional leadership, creativity, and dedication. One of my responsibilities as executive director that I especially enjoy is organizing the Truman Award selection process and committee. Our distinguished committee this year includes Bob Berg, Ignacio Jauregui, Alina Shivkowski, last year's Truman Award honorable mention Matt Daggett, and SID-Washington staffer Janine Kamwene. Before the presentation of the award, I have one important announcement. Many of you know Andy Rice, one of SID's founders and first executive secretary, and an ex officio board member. Andy has been tireless in his efforts for SID on international development and in the nurturing of young professionals in the field. He has been a true inspiration and role model to generations of development practitioners and activists. I am pleased to announce that in recognition of Andy's leadership, this award will be named in his honor. The first such award will be bestowed at next year's SID World Congress here in Washington, a fact that makes Andy especially proud, given his vision for and unflagging efforts on the 2011 Congress. Although Andy couldn't be here today, let's all take this opportunity to thank him for his commitment to this organization. For the presentation of this year's award, I am so pleased to have Truman Award Committee member Bob Berg with us today. Bob is a senior leader of the development community. He founded USAID's Office of Evaluation and was founding chair of evaluation for the OECD's Development Assistance Committee. He was president and chair of the International Development Conference, then the largest forum on international development in the U.S. Currently, Bob is co-director of the United Nations Association Graduate Fellows Program. Bob is a former first vice president of SID International and a former member of the SID Governing Council, and is also a lifetime member of SID-Washington. Time and again, he has demonstrated his commitment to mentoring students and young professionals in international development. Bob helped create the original Truman Award and later brought it under SID-Washington's wing. I can think of no better person to present the final Truman Award today. Bob?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Joe. That's very kind of you. Andy Rice, who is gravely ill, appreciates your generous honoring of him very much, and in typical humility says it isn't deserved. He has been a life model for many of us, and this time I really disagree with him. He does deserve this award being named for him. He took a little idea to create a professional association for developers and made a global organization out of it. He created an international board of future ministers of finance and foreign affairs. He started the first news service about international development, the first journal of international development, the first major blueprint for the Peace Corps, numerous major innovations to make a community of us in the U.S. and around the world, to make us grow, to make us worthy. So it is right that we award real innovation with this award. A few days ago, I returned from speaking at a major conference on science and technology in the Middle East. A number of Nobel Prize winners addressed us at the fabulous Library of Alexandria. These winners all said that making their innovation was relatively straightforward, but selling their innovation, that was the really hard part. So as a juror of this award, let me address a word to the supervisors, managers, and CEOs among you. From the history of these awards, it is clear that some of you executives want recognition for those who play the hand dealt to them. Play it well. Nothing wrong with that, but not for this award. Our prize is for people who nicely challenge whether to use the deck handed to them or to play a different and better game. Could it be that really innovative people are having a hard time getting really innovative changes adapted within your organizations? Is that why so many of our winners have had to embark on their own to put their innovations into practice? These questions are meant as a challenge to us all. And so we come to this year's winner. Read his short bio in your program. A wonderful innovator of the use of cell phones in promoting health care in Malawi, a country you just have to love if you've ever been there. He started his own organization and is doing a lot of good for people. But as an innovator, when the earthquake in Haiti struck, he quickly took what he knew and applied it there. Within a few weeks, he had collected 60,000 geotagged cell phone messages of need. He'd had them segmented and delivered to first responders to guide them to the people most needing rescue. I predict that humanitarian responses will not be the same in the years to come. Josh Nesbitt has collected a number of awards, but this is the first in which his own community says, "Fine so far, Josh, now just keep being a great social entrepreneur." And at age 23, he has a lot of running room. Josh, come up here and collect the Truman Award.
So I'll keep this very quick. I will humbly accept this award on behalf of all of the people who have helped us to build in the last couple of years. Mentors, family, friends, teammates, people across 10 countries. And I really do feel that as the world becomes increasingly flat, we have this responsibility as global citizens and this opportunity to engage. But at the same time, we also have the chance to spread thanks. So I'll be spreading your warm appreciation to everyone that has touched me and touched our team. And really appreciate this and look forward to connecting with you. Thanks.
I'm here to introduce, it's really actually my pleasure and a real privilege to introduce to you our keynote speaker this afternoon, Mr. Michael Klein. Michael is actually somebody that, as I was thinking about what to say about him, I've known Michael, on and off for the last 15 years or so, and I know it's 15 years because I was pregnant with my second child, and she's going to be 15, so I'm fairly certain. And at times, Michael has been my client, and at times he's been my colleague, and all the time he's been a real source of learning a real source of inspiration as a development practitioner. I've learned a lot from him, so it's particularly a nice privilege for me to be able to introduce him. Michael was, until last year, in the World Bank. He was the vice president, as Betsy said earlier this morning, the vice president for financial and private sector development of the World Bank, and the chief economist at the IFC. Now, either one of those jobs would be taxing any incredibly energetic and competent individual, and Michael brought to both jobs, which he held at the same time, a great deal of energy, a great deal of passion, and a great deal of innovation. Michael, in addition to his time at the bank, has also been at the OECD. He's been involved with Amnesty International, and he's been the chief economist at Royal Dutch Shell Group. So in fact, I think it's that experience where he's been in, obviously in donor organizations, in NGOs, and in the corporate sector that provides a particularly rich perspective through which to observe and analyze this topic of private sector development, enterprise development. And in fact, as actually Betsy also mentioned this morning, he has been the architect and the real driving force behind doing business. And it was such a simple idea, right? Just look at, ways of measuring the cost to firms of business regulations, do it in a uniform way that allows comparisons across countries, do it in 178 countries, and rank those countries. And suddenly what you have are rankings of development, reform champions and leaders and laggards. And that has created a very interesting and new market in reform, where none existed before. That is a real innovation. And of course, doing business has its critics, but whether you love them or hate them, there's no question that they've changed the conversation that donors, host country governments, and implementing partners have had around enterprise development and have had around economic growth. So without further delay, let me ask Michael to come up and present to you. Thank you.
Well, Tessie, thank you very much for these maybe overly kind words. And many thanks to SID for the invitation and the honor to speak here. So I've been asked to say a few words on perspectives on private sector development. And I will do so in blocks on a certain set of topics. Private sector development is everywhere, and everything could be private or is private to some degree, and the interfaces between private and public action are everywhere. So I've made a selection without apology. And then there will be a special session with critics of doing business at the end. No? So we're having coffee, and I'll start off with this debate about living without one latte grande per day. You all know Jeff Sachs, and 10 years ago when we wrote the private sector development strategy at the World Bank, it was a time when some UN office and Jeff assisting and so on came up with an estimate of how much money is needed annually to help eradicate extreme poverty. And without mentioning the estimate right now, I would like you to make the following thought experiment. If somebody came to you and offered a totally foolproof system to eradicate extreme poverty, so nobody would be living below $1 or $1.25 per day anymore if X, Y, and Z happened. Now, this is stretching the imagination that you can have such a proposition, which is 100, 200% convincing. But if you imagine for a second that somebody has come up with a miracle and found that proposition and is making it to you, would you be willing for the next 5 years to commit, if enough other people do so as well, so subject to that, to have one latte grande per day less and donate that money? That's $4, roughly. If it's not latte grande, take something else, some other poison that you use. So imagine for a second, would you be willing to commit to such a contract? $4 a day, one coffee less, if you could be sure that extreme poverty were a thing of history and no longer existing at all. Some raised their hands, not many. More, yes, okay, all right, good. Well, if you multiply 4 by 365, the number of days in a year, and if you multiply that number by the number of people who constitute the richest 1% of people in the world, you arrive roughly at $100 billion. So by having one coffee less per day, amongst the richest 1% of people in the world, you would raise $100 billion. Those of us who have been or are in the fundraising business, if you have a foolproof, totally convincing proposition, we'll probably be able to do that. A little direct mail campaign and so on would get us there. Now, $100 billion was not the number mentioned by Jeff Sachs and the UN in 2000, roughly, as what was needed. It was $50 billion. But later, as Bill Easterly likes to point out, we always try and double the amounts. So later on, the number became 100 billion. So even if it's 100 billion, which is roughly equivalent to all official development aid, if we had that perfect proposition, we would be able to make it happen. Privately, without any official development aid, if you wish. And so this all goes to say that what really is the key to development is the effective mechanism to help eradicate poverty, not so much the money per se. Maybe that's obvious, but that's one way of making the point. And so then the question is, what kind of mechanisms can we talk about to eradicate poverty? And the one that everybody talks about, and it has been a subject matter this morning, is job creation. And of course it must be true that job creation is important for eradicating development because it generates income, and that's what is required. At the same time, people who, as some people from the ILO have mentioned, if you have unemployment, formal unemployment, it's actually a sign of a luxury position because poor people have not the luxury to be fully unemployed. And a statement from the study that the World Bank did roughly 10 years ago, Voices of the Poor, is given here. Where was it? Disappeared? So one person in Pakistan said, the rich have one permanent job, the poor are rich in many jobs. And so the issue is not, I would argue, so much job creation per se, it's the creation of productive jobs. If you want to create jobs, just jobs, it's easy. You set up a public sector enterprise and you hire everybody. And then everybody has a job, and as in the eastern part of my home country, Germany, they used to say, and then we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. The real issue is productive jobs. So, and that sometimes gets lost in the discussion that productivity improvements are key to poverty reduction. To some extent, it's a tautology, because you can't have income increases without productivity increases, but when you look at actual proposals in development, that sometimes gets lost. Likewise, we do have, given the data that exist, the basic stylized facts that within countries, inequality in developing countries has not changed a lot in the recent decades. Inequality has changed between countries. Some countries have moved ahead, others stayed behind, but within countries they haven't. So the only way to reduce poverty that has been found to work is to raise growth within countries. That goes again to to job creation for productive jobs. And Tessie has already mentioned the Doing Business Project. There we can, with some reason, say that over the last 5 years, the countries that adopted reforms similar to those advocated in the Doing Business report, that has created about 60 to 7 million jobs in the developing world over 5 years, which compares to a total global labor force of about 2.6 billion people and unemployment that is officially measured at 170 million by the ILO. So this is a massive contribution to job creation by enabling new productive enterprises to join the market. And it is in the spirit, and that's why I put this picture here of Hernando de Soto's approach to reducing entry barriers for individuals and creating property rights that help them perform. So that's a few remarks on job creation. Another approach that has been much advocated and quite popular in recent times, access to finance. And major progress has been made. Points of sales, shops in Brazil on the upper left hand, function also as mechanisms to provide financial services to poor people. Microfinance has had a lot of support, a lot of success, proven also in detailed evaluations. And finally, maybe, one can argue endlessly about this, one of the most intriguing business models, maybe the most intriguing business model out of Africa, has come out of this access to finance movement, which is the transaction services via mobile phone by M-Pesa in Kenya. M-Pesa in Kenya at the moment, as many of you will know, conducts more transactions money transfer transactions per year than all of Western Union worldwide. And this for average transaction balances of about $3. So a lot has been achieved in this access to finance space. At the same time, one may need to recognize a few limitations on this. One, there's a bit more evaluation here and there that shows how to calibrate our mind around this. One debate that you will be familiar with is that it's not clear that the microfinance movement has done a lot to really raise productivity in countries and overall poverty levels, and hasn't created that much wealth to really move in a major way the poverty levels across countries. And as Esther Duflo from the MIT Poverty Lab here in this presentation also points out, there are, for example, some studies that suggest that in Bangladesh, Grameen itself has helped, but not more than other mechanisms operating in the country. So we need to be a little careful about while there is success, what the success can be expected to achieve overall. And then we had this financial crisis last year and the year before, and it's still not over. And part of it was an excessive push towards access to finance. The US housing policy is an access to finance policy which was pushed a lot by the political establishment in this country and many other players. And as part of that, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, arguably the two biggest development finance institutions in the world, took on between themselves $1 trillion of subprime debt, as did a bunch of private banks that were pushed into this also, for example, by instruments like the Community Reinvestment Act in this country. And altogether, that was one major factor bringing us the global financial crisis, because it eroded underwriting standards and did not help overall raise productivity, but destroyed value at the end of the day. And unfortunately, when you look at Eastern Europe, which is the region in emerging markets most affected by the financial crisis per se, and if you look at the Balkans there and the microfinance institutions, it appears from the data that exists so far that in those financial sectors most hit, microfinance institutions actually performed a lot worse than many others. And here again, this is an example which prima facie, talking to practitioners, the great studies will surely still come, suggests that there may have been excessive push of access to finance leading to the adoption of weak underwriting standards de facto and the provision of finance to people who actually did not promote productivity and sustainable growth with this. And so once again, access to finance is good to help people have a chance who don't have an uncle in parliament or in the government. But it's not good to give to people who don't have a good idea and can improve productivity as well. Now, there's other reasons why you might want to do access to finance, but overall, it has to be linked to growth of productivity. Then human capital is important, health and education. And here, when you look at the provision, for example, of health services, but also education services, and this is about basic health services and primary education, you find that in a lot of the poorest countries of the world, when you actually see who do people get their services from, it is from private sector providers in many cases. These are some numbers from Africa. India, for example, has even higher provision of basic health services from private providers. And then the reaction is, oh my God, the private sector is doing all of this must be bad, because this must be witch doctors, badly educated people. We need to have a new health system that helps bring to everybody the benefits of a well-organized public system. And the question here is, what's our attitude towards this overall approach? And there have now been some of the more interesting studies on not only on who do people get their services from, but what's the quality of those services. And a basic pattern has emerged in those studies that exist, and you can always argue whether they're good enough and whether more studies are not needed. But anyway, the basic pattern that has emerged is as follows. India, for example, around the Delhi area, a study has been done that broadly distinguishes three sets of healthcare providers. The formal private ones who tend to service the rich, the public sector service, and then the informal private sector providers of health services. And the first set of the study said, how well educated are these people? The witch doctor argument. No? So the private formal providers were the best educated, followed with very little distance by the public sector healthcare officials, who had also received relatively good training, and then trailing a bit behind the informal private healthcare providers. And then but then the study also had a neat extra twist. It found a way to confront doctors, and it controlled for the presence of the doctor with diagnostic cases. And so the quality of diagnostic skills was also measured. And here again, the private formal system performed best, followed with little distance by the private informal system, and with some distance behind the public sector system. And the same pattern has been observed in education studies in 4 countries in Africa, in China, and in India. And what, of course, if one believes these stories and believes that there's a message in these studies, it means that education and the capacity of the providers is important, but what is arguably even more important is the incentive to exert themselves and to actually apply the knowledge they have achieved. And that, in those systems where parents have paid, is stronger than in systems where parents don't. Then infrastructure. Infrastructure obviously is also important. And because of the endless problems with getting infrastructure, particularly water services, to poor people, a lot has been made about public-private partnerships as new innovative ways of bringing poor people access to water, for example. But here again, there's no magic in public-private partnerships. What is more important is the basics, the fundamentals. In this case, pricing of water, not so much how innovative the financial engineering or the contractual arrangements might be. And to get at that point, compare water and telephony. Here's a set of statistics from African countries. Broadly speaking, this holds